Well, welcome all. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say that I'm the dean here at the Graham School at the University of Chicago. And we are looking at autumn just around the corner, and we are thrilled to be beginning our conversations at Graham, where we profile a number of the upcoming courses by having conversations with their visionary instructors. And today we're actually profiling a course in our September catalog. So it is technically summer, although everyone else in the world believes it is actually autumn by early to mid-September. So this is a class on competing worldviews, and it is being taught by Jennifer Lind. And we are thrilled to have Jennifer with us today to have a conversation about it. Jennifer holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University SAIS in international relations and U.S. foreign policy. She subsequently worked in the U.S. State Department and the USAID in Washington, D.C., and she also worked in the former Yugoslavia and in several sub-Saharan African countries. She recently, and most importantly to us, completed her Master of Liberal Arts here at the University of Chicago Graham School, focusing on U.S. foreign policy and international relations course design, which she has since brought into the world through these classes that have been beloved by our lifelong learners. Her current civic leadership in the Chicago area utilizes various community education projects. Jennifer, thank you for joining us. We're very excited to have you.
Thank you, Seth. I'm delighted to be here.
So as an instructor, you've brought a very distinctive approach to learning opportunities because you combine international relations with close reading of texts, which, as you know, is something that we love here at the Graham School. And it reflects this marriage between the graduate education I mentioned you happen to have at SAIS in international relations and the Master of Liberal Arts here, where you really look deeply at text and literature and many other disciplines. Can you talk a bit about how you got the idea to teach courses at the intersection of international relations and close textual reading?
Sure. Yes. And thank you for asking. Thank you for hosting me. And thank you for everyone who's joining us today. And I can see already people from around the country and even overseas. So it's wonderful. I'm grateful for your interest. Um, Marrying international relations and close textual readings for me really comes naturally. International relations has always been my passion, my background, both professionally and academically. And international relations as a field of study is essentially the study of interactions between countries, states, nation states, right? And it's always important. Certainly now, as our world seems ever more interconnected, it's a wonderful time to dive deep into the field. To begin, first international relations, then textual readings. To begin to study the field of international relations, to think about, to try to understand our incredibly complex, complicated world, the first thing we need to do is look at international relations theories. Theories are tools. They're essential tools to understanding this field. They're tools that help us make sense of disparate facts around our wider world, this world we live in. And at the end of the Cold War, three incredibly influential, eminent US scholars put forward theories on how the world would work after the Cold War, after the end of the Cold War. And these were three articles, predecessor articles to seminal books that are undergirded by international relations theories. And these seminal works attracted enormous attention. And looking at close textual reading, which again is the essential sort of element of the Graham learning, looking at close textual reading of these three predecessor articles to seminal books that are competing views is really a wonderful place to begin to study international relations, this marriage of text and international relations. I would add close readings of three competing texts, right? They're mutually exclusive. They disagree and argue with each other. Looking at those IR theories that undergird these competing views is really, embracing the ethos of the Graham School in a spirit of joint inquiry that we'll do together.
Well, so let's jump into these texts. So there is the end of history, the clash of civilizations, and the tragedy of great power politics. And I want to start by laying out the kind of context and core ideas embedded in each of these.
Sure.
And so let's start with The End of History by Francis Fukuyama and talk a little bit about, who wrote it, the person that Fukuyama was, and what is the worldview that it presents.
Sure. So Francis Fukuyama, all three of our authors, Francis Fukuyama included, have ties to the University of Chicago. Francis Fukuyama was born in Hyde Park. His father taught religious studies at the university. Francis Fukuyama, although he did his studies elsewhere, he was a scholar. He was a political, he teaches now at Stanford.
I didn't know that. Apologies for my poor use of the past tense there.
Right. Sure. Francis Fukuyama is currently a professor at Stanford. In 1989, he came to the University of Chicago in February 1989, and those dates are very important. And he gave a speech titled "The End of History?" He had left the Rand Corp in California, and he was on his way to the State Department where he would work, and he was 36 years old. He was going to work as in the policy planning office, on the policy planning staff of the State Department. And he stopped in Chicago to give this now famous or infamous, depending on your worldview, speech, which caught the attention of someone at the National Interest, that scholarly journal, who asked him if he would turn it into an article they would publish in the summer of 1989. That predecessor article became his book that was published in 1992. Essentially, Francis Fukuyama argued that the Cold War was ending. It wasn't over one day, right? And it is important to remember the Berlin Wall came down in November 89. So he wrote his speech and article a year before the wall fell down. He penned it in the fall of 1988. He took a Hegelian view of history. He thinks of history in the Hegelian and Marxist sense as development or progress. He viewed a wagon train, sort of like Marx, that we were all headed to the same station. And Fukuyama's view was Marx's view was wrong. The final station on human progress, on history, was not communism, but rather liberal democracy. He saw Marx as entirely wrong. Communism was defeated by the West, led by the United States. We defeated Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and now communist Soviet Union. The world would now become homogeneous states. Everybody would embrace liberal democracy because he saw that as the only coherent sort of alternative form of government that could encompass cultures and countries throughout the world. That's the essential sort of point of Francis Fukuyama's End of History article.
Well, so let's look to the second text, and I think you're all going to quickly see that these are texts that are nonlinear and that in many ways compete rather than build just on each other. Can we talk about the Clash of Civilizations, which came just a little bit later? When is this written, by whom, and most importantly, what lens does it offer us on international relations?
Sure. So the Clash of Civilization was also first a predecessor article to a book of a similar title. The title of the book is Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. So Samuel Huntington, who died in 2008, he was a professor in the political science department at Harvard for 50 years. And he did his master's at the University of Chicago. So he had strong ties to the university. In direct response to Francis Fukuyama's article and book, Samuel Huntington wrote an article that was published in the summer of 1993 in Foreign Affairs magazine called The Clash of Civilizations. Essentially, and I'll read a quote from him, he said, Samuel Huntington replied to Fukuyama saying, the most important distinctions among peoples are not ideological or political or economic, they are cultural. So Samuel Huntington argued that Francis Fukuyama was wrong, that Francis Fukuyama's solution was spreading liberal democracy to create homogeneous states who would no longer go to war or have security conflict. Samuel Huntington said, no, Francis Fukuyama, your solution is actually the problem, that by pushing for a homogeneous sort of nation states, going towards liberal democracy, you will simply stoke the fires of different civilizational conflicts that were kept under the rug during the Cold War, or as John Lewis Gaddis put it, the Long Peace. So Samuel Huntington said, the world will now, sort of anarchy will return because the stability of the Cold War is over, and future sources of conflict will be civilizations.
Well, so the final piece here is very connected to the university because it comes from John Mearsheimer, who is a professor here. Can you talk about the tragedy of great power politics and how it compares to these two other theories we've named so far?
Sure, absolutely. So Professor Mearsheimer, who currently he currently teaches at the University of Chicago, and he has been teaching at the university since 1982. So first and foremost, Professor Mearsheimer's response. So these three scholars absolutely were responding to. They were in conversation with each other, and I put these in this order mindfully. You could argue different orders, but Professor Mearsheimer's article, that's the predecessor article to his 2001 book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. The article is actually titled "Why We Will Soon Miss the Cold War," which was published in between the other two in August 1990 in the Atlantic Monthly. That same article, in its more academic version, was published in the International Security Scholarly Journal the same summer in 1990 with a different title that directly addresses Francis Fukuyama, and that title is Back to the Future. So Professor Mearsheimer is arguing in these predecessor articles to his book, Tragedy, that in fact, he said, Francis Fukuyama, you're wrong. The world will not become made up of liberal democracies. And Samuel Huntington, you're wrong. Civilizational differences will not be the driving force of conflict in the global arena, but rather the stability of the bipolar Cold War will be over. So this untamed anarchy, to use a Hobbesian term, will return. It's going to be a tragedy because a tragedy in the Reinhold Niebuhr sense, despite a desire for peace, nation states are inevitably going to be in war because of the nature of the global system. Without bipolar Cold War, which was a long peace, anarchy's out there. There's no global, Professor Mearsheimer says, no global watchman. There's no 911 to call on a global level. And so he argues in his piece, we will miss the stability of the Cold War as we become a multipolar world of great powers who resume to their previous sort of interactions where the centrality of war was constant. So he essentially says, the more things change, the more they stay the same. We're back to great power politics.
Well, so it's very clear from the timeline that you offered and from the arguments themselves that these works are talking to one another. And
Yes.
so could you describe a little bit how these pieces respond to or speak to each other and how you look at that in the class as you read the text?
Sure, sure. And in the class, so again, we offer at the Graham School, we offer 3-week September classes. So this is something I've wanted to do for a long time, and it fits nicely. These 3 weeks, we will do a deep dive in each article each week. We will focus on a deep dive of each article because there are countless moving parts out there. So it's not sort of a military history class of all things sort of global. And we'll look at first, with the deep dive of each article, first try to understand what the authors are saying and then critique them, right? Do we agree? Do we disagree? Are they right? Are they wrong? And how do they speak to each other? For example, Fukuyama was a political theorist who focused his academic career on the Soviet Union. He really comes at it from a Marxist Hegelian perspective. And he, of course, comes to the conclusion that Marx was wrong. Huntington fully disagrees with him, right? He thinks Fukuyama's solutions are actually the problem. And they speak to each other literally in their articles. Fukuyama thought liberal democracy was, think of it like a wagon train. The liberal democracy was the final stop in history. And Samuel Huntington said, absolutely not. There are many different, like to use the wagon train analogy that Fukuyama says, there are many different tracks and many different stations. And then Professor Mearsheimer says, well, that's great, guys. And all these nice ideas about ideology and principles and liberal democracy, that's just grand, but it's not how the world works. He says, Professor Mearsheimer's article reveals a completely drastically different way of seeing the whole world. He says there's no progression towards enlightenment, like Hegel might have said, but rather the globe is made up of nation states that are black boxes. doesn't matter what kind of government they have. It's the structure of the anarchic international order that dictates the centrality of war. So they're really entirely at odds with each other, which makes for a much more interesting class.
You mentioned a number of great books in what you described from their articles, right? So you have theories from Hegelian background, you have Hobbes' State of Nature, and this idea that life in this world post-Soviet Union could be, brutal and short without that kind of world order. Can you talk a bit about how these texts invite some of these time-honored questions, and how we might look at these texts and their legacies 30 years after they're written?
Sure. How they relate to time-honored questions. Essentially, so each author is positing a perspective on the world, on how the world works. And undergirding these pieces, undergirding their work, is a theory on international relations. And these theories reflect world experiences, right? Think of Henry Kissinger, right? He didn't wake up one morning and go to the White House and choose from a menu. Should I be realist today? Should I be a liberalist today? Should I be an internationalist? He had theories in his head based on his worldviews and his world experiences. And those theories change. Those theories change as we age, where we live different places, as we have different conversations, as different world events occur. And when we do these deep dives into great books, like we will into these articles that became seminal books, the goal is not so much a destination, but a perspective, right? And I think when I think of these time-honored books, I think right away of Aristotle's Ethics in the basic program. When you do a deep dive in joint inquiry with fellow lifelong learners, it doesn't really change the world outside, but it might really change the world inside your four walls.
Yeah.
It might change your relationships. It might change the perspective and the life inside yourself. We say we read these great books in part to understand ourselves. And I think by doing a deep dive into international relations theories and competing theories, we may have a different perspective on how we see the world and how we see our part in it. Not to say we're solving world peace, but we can be better learners, right? Have a more nuanced view of this complicated world.
So my final question, and then I'm going to come to the questions that are already populating the chat. You have 3 weeks. You have
Yes.
3 texts. You have 3 very contrasting worldviews. How are you going to teach a class like this? And especially, how might you engage students who do not have an international relations background?
Well, this one's kind of easy. I like that. Keep it simple strategy, right? We will, as a good lifelong learner, right? We are all learning together, right? At the Graham School, we are peers, and we will focus on the texts. We will take one article, and and they're all posted on Canvas, and they're also online. We will not look at the books. We're not looking at military history. We're not looking at sort of the world at large. We will each week do a deep dive into the 3 articles: End of History, Clash of Civilizations, and Why We Will Soon Miss the Cold War. We will together, in the Socratic method, right, come to understand what each author is saying, what they were saying in the era when they were written, and along the lines of Professor Ada Palmer, as she would say, we will consider what were the big questions of the day when these pieces were written. And then we can assess their legacies 35 years later. Who was right? Was anybody right? Did any of these create a conventional wisdom? Francis Fukuyama's argument had a lot of agency in the 1990s, right? It seemed like liberal democracy was on the march. Well, then after 9/11, Samuel Huntington's book, which was published in 96, became a bestseller. It's still widely taught. After 9/11, the idea of civilizational conflicts and Islamic countries versus the West, that took on a lot of agency. And then with the rise of China in the mid-20 teens, Professor Mearsheimer's book, really, his argument took on a lot of agency. So we'll assess them 35 years later as really tools to help us understand our world.
Well, so I am now, Jennifer, going to turn over to the chat, and we have many great questions. And actually the first here relates to what you've just talked about, because you described 9/11 happens and then people gravitate maybe momentarily to the Huntington view of the world. And then, China rises in a certain way, and there begins to be some conflict between us and China, and people look at Mearsheimer and they say, oh, maybe there is this tragedy of great power politics. So here's the question from Tom Miller that naturally follows. Is there any history of seismic changes in IR theories, sans major, without major events, such as war, the overthrow of a powerful state, or a relatively nonviolent event like the fall of the Berlin Wall? So, how critical is it to changes in the way that we look at IR and the theories that we have these kind of seismic events in the world?
That is an excellent question from Tom Miller. Thank you. It's hard to think, right? Like a huge change in international relations theories came right before World War I. Norman Angell wrote the book, The Great Illusion, and he said economic integration throughout Europe and Asia, wider Europe and Asia, from European colonies, would prevent war. And that was published in 1909 or 1910, 4 years before World War I. It was a seismic change in international relations theories. In other words, democratic peace theory and economic integration would not prevent war, right? I cannot think of a huge change without a world war or the end of the Cold War. But I'll look into that and get back to Tom. That's an excellent question. Thank you.
Greg Gosek asks, doesn't international reality in the period since the three articles show that they were all incorrect, in that there is a discernible trend to a new bipolarism via the conflict between the US and China and their respective like-minded coalitions?
The short answer there is yes. Each of our authors was absolutely wrong on many fronts, right? Francis Fukuyama was wrong to suggest that to invite China into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 1999, Francis Fukuyama thought, well, look at the Soviet Union. Perestroika and glasnost go together. Let's invite China in to the Western rules-based order, into the WTO, because perestroika, economic sort of liberalism, will lead to democracy. And we see now that was entirely wrong. So Francis Fukuyama was wrong on that point. And just to add an important note, Bill Clinton was wrong. He agreed with Francis Fukuyama when he said economic liberalism, economic openness in China will prevent China from becoming authoritarian. He said President Clinton said, trying to nail the internet to the wall would be like trying to control the internet would be like nailing Jello to the wall. President Clinton was entirely wrong. Fukuyama was wrong. China's been able to maintain its authoritarian grip and become economically prosperous. Samuel Huntington was wrong. Samuel Huntington writes in this piece that Russia and Ukraine would not go to war because they share the same civilization. Samuel Huntington was also wrong on China. He said China and Taiwan share the same civilization, culture, language, heritage, so they would not be at odds. So they're all wrong in different ways. And Professor Mearsheimer, while he was absolutely right on China and sort of that war is here to stay, Professor Mearsheimer was wrong. He did not foresee the unipolar moment. He foresaw European great powers kind of returning to pre-World War I. He foresaw Germany. He foresaw Russia and Germany at odds. So they're all wrong in different ways, yet they have a lot to teach us nevertheless.
Jerry asks, do you believe we ought to actualize cosmopolitanism? I would say something like liberal democracy, but that term appears soiled by Fukuyama.
Yes, all three authors speak to this question. To actualize cosmopolitanism, liberal democracy, universalism, sort of liberalized internationalism. Well, Professor Samuel Huntington and Professor Mearsheimer would agree on this point that a sort of universalist U.S. foreign policy and foreign policy by the West provokes more conflict, that we're basically messing in countries where we shouldn't be. that we're just fighting unwinnable wars, didn't learn anything from Vietnam with the 20-year forever wars, would be their point. And that by trying to push our values, our principles of liberal democracy, we are actually creating more conflict and making ourselves and other countries less safe. That's what their worldview would be. Fukuyama said, no, we should try to encourage liberal democracy because then he really believes in democratic peace theory and that democracies don't go to war with each other. So we would have less conflict if liberal democracy spread.
Tom Miller asks, do we misunderstand theories as forever, in quotes, human constructs that are meant in and of themselves, metaphorically, quote, the end of history? So, there's literally that statement by Fukuyama, but in some ways, there's a similar statement in these other two on the end of history, because they're kind of saying we're forever going to be in this clash of civilizations. We're forever going to, be just about realpolitik. How do you think about these theories and the fact that all of them in some ways are trying to make statements of permanence, not necessarily saying, well, there's a certain situational context in which people will act realpolitik, or a certain situational context, which we're in right now, where we might see ourselves in culture wars. Your thoughts?
Sure. Yes, I do criticize our authors. We should criticize them in many ways. And in one way, to this point, theories are dynamic. Theories can and should change and adapt. That to say blanketly, sort of in 1989, democratic peace theory, full stop, that feels very short-sighted, right? And rather than theories can change, can adopt, we can learn. One way I really like to think about and talk about a theory is think about child rearing. As a parent, when a child misbehaves, there are many ways we could respond. We could put them in timeout. We could remove them from the playground. We could spank them. We could, do various things. How we respond depends on theories in our heads. We might have a theory that spanking is never right, so we do other things. Take away the car keys for a teenager. And that theory in our head of how to respond changes over time. We learn, we grow, and we see other instances, we see other experiences, we see other people's theories, other behaviors, kind of like Henry Kissinger, right? He changed his theories as the world changed. So hopefully theories can change and evolve and adapt.
Well, I will say as a parent, I find that a very useful metaphor. And occasionally, although my kids are wonderful, we do see a clash of civilizations and some great power politics taking place among our 10 and 13-year-olds. So I'll think about these scripts as a dad and as a citizen. So Jennifer, you are not just teaching this class at the Graham School in September. You are also teaching what I think is a really interesting course in the autumn quarter on what is called The Quiet and the Ugly American, where you're going to be reading two of the most highly influential political novels of the 20th century. Can you talk a little bit about that class? Because I'd love to preview that for our audience here as well as an example of another international relations course coming up.
Sure. And this class will have two sections. I will teach this class online Wednesday mornings in Chicago time, and Thursday afternoons, I will teach it in person at the Gleacher Center. And actually, that brings up a related point I see in the chat. I think this September class might already be full. So I would have to defer those questions to you, Seth, how to work that. So the autumn course, because September at the Graham School is still summer, right? So the autumn course beginning October 1st on the U.S. war in Vietnam, we will, again, take a deep dive into our readings. And we're looking at two novels that offer competing answers on the U.S. involvement in the war in Vietnam. The Quiet American, which was published by British author Graham Greene in 1955, and The Ugly American, which was published in 1958 by two former Navy officers, Eugene Burdick and William Lederer. Again, these two novels are in conversation. One is in a response to the other. Graham Greene's account is of the breakdown of French colonialism and the beginnings of the U.S. involvement in the war in Vietnam, which at that time of his novel was really a French war. He implicitly questions the foundations of U.S. involvement in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia. He uses a love triangle. It's a novel, it's fiction, to to unpack this quagmire that he predicts the U.S. is jumping into, and the catastrophic events for all involved. And The Ugly American, which was published in 1958, again by Burdick and Lederer, it became an instant bestseller because then President JFK, he was in Congress, he carried around the book and he bought a copy for everyone in the Senate. JFK pushed that book heavily. He was so influenced by that. And these authors basically draw on their experience serving in the U.S. Navy to depict kind of, the failures of U.S. diplomatic corps in Southeast Asia. It's really a critical examination of U.S. policy in Southeast Asia. So using these two slim novels, the aim of the fall course is really to answer the question, given the calamitous consequences, both at home and overseas, and given that the United States clearly lost the war in Vietnam, we want to answer the question, how did this happen? How do superpowers, how do great powers get into unwinnable wars that are arguably, where it's unclear if they're in the superpower's national interest or not? So we'll look at those two really excellent novels.
Well, I do want to call out to the question that you mentioned that there is a possibility of us adding a second section for your upcoming class in September. And so in the chat, for those who are interested, if you add yourself to the wait list, we need to reach a certain point where we would know that we'd have at least a 6-person minimum, and then we'll open that class up. So that I want to make sure people know, even though your class right now is full, is a possibility should you be interested. Just go in the wait list, and then we'll have a second section. As Jennifer mentioned, her class in autumn, the Quiet and Ugly American, has 2 sections, an in-person and an online, and they do currently have some availability. Let me come back now to the questions that are still here in the chat. Suzanne asks, you mentioned Bill Clinton's acceptance of Fukuyama's theory and error. Can you make connections between other administrations and these authors? So are there ways in which these views influence, administrations to come? I have one in mind, but you're the expert here, Jennifer.
Well, thank you. That's also an excellent question. The first thing that comes to mind is, after 9/11, right, Samuel Huntington's piece took on all new meaning and new agency. And after 9/11, several years after, George W. Bush, in his second inaugural speech, he said, the United States national interests and our values, our stated principles, our morals, which he described as Christian values, are one and the same. He viewed U.S. foreign policy as morally required to spread liberal democracy around the world. And the war in Iraq, he viewed it in that lens, and that spreading liberal democracy was not just the right, but it goes back to Henry Luce in the American Century, but rather the mission, the moral mission of the United States. And Samuel Huntington would have said, you're only stoking hatred. It brings up the question, why do they hate us? Why do we have enemies? Why are there these wars? Is it because of who we are, or is it because of our policies? So George W. Bush would follow Fukuyama's theories, and that's one example. Another big example, Madeleine Albright's comment. So this is during the Clinton years of the 90s, when she said the United States is the indispensable nation. She said, we stand taller, we see further. That, in other words, we defeated, World War I, World War II, the Cold War. The United States is on top. We're the indispensable nation. We are secure in our hemisphere with the Monroe Doctrine. It's up to us to spread liberal democracy and make the world safe for liberal democracy. So she also would have embraced Fukuyama's theory, his argument, which Huntington and Mearsheimer would strongly disagree with. And they would say it's not just not the solution, but it's the problem.
We have a question from John in the chat. Are these theories very Western-centric? Where does a world order organized around imperialism and colonialism come in?
Absolutely. They are Western-centric, and that is also a criticism. They look at the legacies of colonialism, right, is what really undergirds a lot of this. And the Western-centered assumptions are something to really look critically at as well. Absolutely. And that's where Huntington is highly criticized because of he posits in his article and later in the book 8 civilizations around the world. For example, he puts Russia and Ukraine together as sharing a common civilization and therefore would never fight. Well, he was wrong on that. That's a specific example of how he's wrong. The other Western-centric view is in the US war in Iraq, which essentially the coalition pretty quickly became Great Britain, or the United Kingdom, the United States, and Kuwait against Iraq, because both Muslim and Arab countries would not continue with a US-led coalition against Iraq. It really came to the fore when Turkey, the NATO ally, said no to the US to use their air bases to bomb Iraq.
Well, so related to the question about maybe a Western centricity, we have a specific question here from Isaac Rainey. Do Fukuyama and Huntington's theories even entertain the idea that liberal democracies can and have made war on their own accord? It seems that they don't believe it is possible for liberal democracies to cause conflict without some kind of instigation from another.
That's another one of the first when we read the critics of these articles, that's one of the first things that come up, because of course, World War I is the obvious example that liberal democracies that can go to war with each other, and that in democratic peace theory, the idea that Europeans were tired of war, look at World War II right after, right? So they do address it in their books, but not as much in the articles. And given that we have a 3-week class, we're going to make every effort to focus on our articles, the deep dive. But of course, we'll address this as well. Absolutely, I think that's a hole in their arguments. And that Professor Mearsheimer addresses this head on. One of Professor Mearsheimer's main criticisms of both Fukuyama and Huntington is that democracies absolutely go to war with non-democracies and with each other. I wanted to interrupt. I thought I saw Rachel's hand up, and I'm not sure if she got a chance to put something in the chat or not. But Rachel,
all right, Rachel, let's hear from you directly. I can unmute you, and we'd love to hear your question.
I saw her hand up earlier. Hello, Rachel. That's okay. Just wanted to make sure she had a chance.
Well, so final question, Jennifer, because we're coming up to time. This is one of these great examples, I think, of why we do our work at the Graham School, because we believe in these big ideas, in some ways timeless debates, right? These are articles written 30 years ago, but they rely on ideas that go back hundreds of years. And while we engage in the timeless and we engage deeply in these great pieces, we also really believe that these are tools and frameworks that we can use every day in our own lives. And we are at a very eventful moment in international relations. To the point made in some of these articles, there is not a world order anymore that can be easily categorized as bipolar or, just a conflict of these two powers. And instead, we have immense ambiguity in the Middle East, in Ukraine, Russia, in our relationship with China. I mean, I could go on and list, but it would be a long list of places where there is, genuine and deep ambiguity about what the international order is, where it's headed. And certainly in my lifetime, a time when, I feel like as I was growing up, you saw the wall fall, I felt like the world was so interconnected. As I was in my 20s and 30s, you could go anywhere in the world and, you wouldn't have to think about whether you could get back home afterward. And then, you have a number of these things certainly accelerated in some ways by the pandemic and all the border closures and other factors that were circumstantial to that. So long way of getting to the question for you, how do all of these frameworks and tools help us to better understand our contemporary world, what's happening right now all around us?
Well, studying these scholars, these works, and these 3 specific articles and competing perspectives, the depth and scope of these arguments helps frame our understanding of the world and of world events. Absolutely, when we read the headlines, it's depressing, right? It can feel hopeless. It's hard to find hope in terms of sort of world events and conflicts and wars throughout the world. Yet the more we study our history, and when in the Graham School, we offer so much history, and by offering these texts in the context of international relations, international politics, and great power politics, it deepens, it enriches our perspective, and it can bring a bit of hope or calm to know we have actually persevered through worse, right? When we think of Thanksgiving in 2016 in the United States, we all thought it's going to be difficult because friends and family disagree on world and domestic events. Well, in fact, that's a common theme throughout history, right? Theodore Roosevelt's mother during the Civil War made packages for her friends and family in the Confederacy, while his father supported the North. They survived. We can have disagreements. We can not understand the world at large, and yet the more we dive into these complicated, complex issues, the more perspective we can have, and the more sort of calm and enlightenment it brings, to our world every day. Really, how we interact with others.
Rachel, I see you off mute. Can we give you the last word here for a question for Jennifer?
Yeah, I wanted to ask when you would register for the 3 weeks course.
I will defer to you, Seth, to answer.
I missed the beginning of that, with apologies.
When should she register for the 3-week class?
Yes. So you want to actually sign up for the wait list if you're interested in Jennifer's class as soon as possible, because I think the technical deadline is later in August. But in order for us to add a new section, we would need to do that right away. And so if we reach a point where there's enough demand from here or elsewhere, I know some people wrote in that they have added themselves to the wait list, then we will open that up and then you can register. But the date on registration, I believe, is the last Thursday in August. I believe it's August 29th is the date. But if you're interested in Jennifer's class in particular in September, then we encourage you to join the wait list now so we know, and then we can open up that new section. And we did see the other comments in the chat in terms of an afternoon preference and making sure that we try to align it with schedules as much as possible.
What are you saying, that she's going to teach the course in 3 weeks or in the fall?
No, this would be the same time period. So it would also occur in that same September, meaning like, early to late September would be the entire class. It would be a second section that parallels it because Jennifer's already busy in the autumn teaching 2 sections of her Quiet and Ugly American. Right. Well, this has been a fabulous conversation, Jennifer. We are incredibly grateful. The fact that all of your classes are so full is a sign that I'm not the only one who feels immensely grateful for all I've learned from you. And I'll just close by saying I'm so excited that you've brought this focus on international relations to our school. We obviously have great leaders here from John Mearsheimer and well beyond. We haven't had as many opportunities for our lifelong community to engage in this content, and especially with the issues we've talked about in the world, what could be a better time to have frameworks to better understand it and to debate where we're headed in the future. Thank you. Thank all of you for joining us, and we look forward to hopefully having you for our next conversation, which will be about music in Americans' lives, and it will explore how individuals and cultures across time have used music in very specific ways to advance a political agenda. And we'll be talking to the new instructor at Graham, who's going to be teaching that class, who brings both musicology and a deep knowledge of history to our community. Thank you all. Have great afternoons. And thanks again, Jennifer.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.